can't make faith claims without good, solid data and information. In fact, the way I put it to my students in the classroom is, if you have a faith claim that is contradicted by science, then you have two options. Either you have to dismiss your faith claim as wrong, or you have to go back at the scientific research and find out where your math went wrong. Because there is a problem. The contradiction between faith and reason is apparent, not real. Whenever the two contradict one another, we have to figure out what we did wrong. Or if I put it another way, I would say, the God that gave us faith is the same God that gave us our reason, so how on earth can they conflict with one another? So I had to do some quick editing of this because since I wrote this slide, several people have dropped out of the election. But just for a thumbnail sketch, what do you notice about this slide? What's of interest in this?
More Catholic than any other.
More Catholic than any other. In fact, I deleted the category for evangelical because the only two presidential candidates who called themselves evangelical have both dropped out. So we've gone from JFK causing all sorts of concern because he was a Catholic running for president to having majority Catholics in the Supreme Court and more Catholics than any other single denomination running for president. So you'd think we're going to be on good grounds, but see, there were 22 and now there's 14. But there might be 16, because what's his name from New York might jump in too. Of the 14, 6 accept anthropogenic. Can I use that word, anthropogenic? It means of human origin. The Greek word is the same root that gives us the word Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, the source book, the original book. So anthropos means human, so anthropogenic means of human origin. So 6 accept anthropogenic climate change, 7 deny it, and 2 have gone back and forth. And Rick Santorum, who is a Catholic and therefore fair game for a Catholic priest, has been called by the New York Post the most climate denialist running in 2016. Actually, I don't think that's true. I think Ted Cruz is. But Santorum was quoted as saying that the church would probably be better off leaving the science to the scientists and focusing on what we're really good at, which is theology and morality, which is a little bit of an insult to a guy who's made his career out of doing environmental ethics. Isn't there an ethical dimension to climate change? He seems to think that there isn't. So here's how it pans out. The candidates, both Democratic and Republican, who confirm that climate change is real and anthropogenic, those who deny it, and then those who used to say yes, but now that they're running for president say no. And if you've noticed that I used yellow ink on the last category, that's just me being snarky. But oops. Pardon me?
I can't believe all of it denied it.
Yeah, the rest of the world can't believe all the denial. By the way, we now have the majority of Americans for the first time actually accept climate change as real, advanced, and anthropogenic. And even the majority of Republicans accept it as real. These are the Pope's terms, by the way. It's real, it's advanced, and it's anthropogenic. Real, advanced, and anthropogenic. So this is IPCC and NASA and EPA. They're talking about it being absolutely anthropogenic. The temperature is rising faster than early projections. So we just crossed the threshold of 1 degree, and that's halfway to the sort of the point of no return, which is 2 degrees. So it's really getting to a very scary moment in our history. I didn't fix this slide yet. It says 19 of the warmest 20. Well, that's still true, but it says 2014 was the warmest year ever recorded. That's no longer true. 2015 is the warmest year ever recorded. And the results will be reduction in crop yield, increase be some intense storms, more wildfires, more rain, more droughts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all know it, right? It's not good, and it's already happening. As a matter of fact, IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their 2014 report, they stopped talking about strategies for making sure that the bad stuff doesn't happen. In fact, the title of the report is called Mitigation Strategies. The two terms that they use are adapt and mitigate. I want you to consider this. I heard some of you talking about certain health issues when you came in. If you went to see a doctor and the doctor says, I have good news for you, I can teach you how to adapt to your situation and we can mitigate the consequences. Would that be good news? Well, it wouldn't be the best news, right? The best news would be, oh, we can fix that. We can get you back on your feet. We can put you back the way you were. But we are no longer talking about that in climate change. We are talking about adapting and mitigating, which is, it's phenomenal that we've basically admitted defeat, that we are not going to keep it from happening. All right. Biodiversity. By the way, climate change is only one issue that Pope talks about, and not very much. He mentions the word climate change 12 times. 6 of those 12 times are in 2 consecutive paragraphs. And all he really says, it's real, it's advanced, it's anthropogenic, I'm not going to fight with you, let's move on. He's not really all that focused on climate change. He also talks about biodiversity. Now, biodiversity, of course, is affected by climate change, but also all sorts of other factors, including habitat destruction and overexploitation of resources. He talks about pollution. And of course, pollution is also related to climate change, isn't it? Deterioration of quality of life. So, in that last line there, risks are unevenly distributed and are generally greater for the disadvantaged peoples and communities, which calls the existence of God into question. Those who are causing the terrible crises are suffering the least of the consequences and benefiting the most from the behavior. Those who are least responsible for the problems are on the front end of bearing the suffering that is caused by it. Does that make sense? It's just it's an unfair distribution of the suffering. So this is an old slide, 2013, but on the other hand, it only gets worse. It doesn't get any better. 68.7% of the global population have 3% of the wealth. 0.7% of the wealth control of the population control 41%. That's no longer true. This came out last week, January 18th. Just 62 people own as much wealth as the 3.5 billion people on the bottom half of the population. As a matter of fact, I couldn't find it to add the slide, but I saw it, I think, on BBC. Those 62 people, because of the oil problems in the stock markets, those 62 people have lost something like $150 billion last week. Imagine being so wealthy that you could lose $150 billion in a week and not even notice it. This was January 18th. The poorest 20% of the world who live below the extreme poverty line live on less than $1.90 a day. Their incomes have barely moved since between 1988 and 2011. On the other hand, the most prosperous 10% saw their incomes jump 42%. Now, the global economy, notice it's a singular, global economy, is just not working. That's, by the way, Oxfam. You saw that report last week, I think. And that's by Pew Research. As for the global middle class, it's a promise, not a reality. The middle class has doubled to 13%, but it still represents a small fraction of the world's population. So, what does the Pope expect government officials to do with his comments? So paragraphs 170, I don't know why I put them out of sequence, 178, 175. He's excoriating, I don't know, you've read at least half of it by now, right? Let me pause, what do you think of the rhetoric of the Pope? What's your reaction to his style, his vocabulary, his phraseology?
I think he's courageous and dead on.
Courageous and dead on? What else?
I thought it was very clear and easy to read.
Absolutely, it's the easiest encyclical I've ever read. Granted, the bar is very low, but
Yeah.
he does a great job. What else? You'll notice he pulls no punches.
He challenged us personally. I think.
Absolutely.
At least I took it very personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Politics concerned with immediate results is driven to produce short-term growth. Governments are reluctant to upset the public with measures which could affect the level of consumption or create risks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Years ago, I was giving a talk in some small town in Illinois, and it happened that a state representative was in the audience. So when I was giving my talk, I pointed out that when we voters consider these issues, we can't punish the legislators who have the courage to tell us what we need to be told and are willing to make the moves that need to be made. The problem is that any politician who tells us what the real consequences are is never going to be elected president. I heard on the radio today, Bernie Sanders said, let me be clear, he said, we will raise taxes. I thought, well, that campaign is now officially over.
Exactly.
So in Iowa, this is the IPCC had a series of national reports and then regional reports. So this comes from that. And I will say this data is not from the 2014 report. It's probably a little bit dated now. But the problem with environmental research is if you read an old report, just make it worse and then you'll be back on track. So we expect to be the new Kansas. Drier and hotter summers, shorter, more intense winters. Both seasons punctuated by more violent storms. The most interesting effect of environmental crises for our part of the world is immigration. Because we are less affected ecologically than other places, people are going to be coming here from places that are no longer habitable. Okay. Any comments about any of this stuff? All right, then I'm going to back up, if I can figure out how to do it. And we'll go to the top in just a minute. All right. I know that you know this, but the Laudato Si is the first line of the canticle by St. Francis, may you be praised. I think the real translation of the Italian should be everything is related, because I believe that this is he's developing a theology of relationship. I'm going to skip a little bit, pardon me for doing this to you, but I want to, oh, this is worth pointing out. He's not really adding much to the conversation that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict haven't already said. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that he even takes a half a step backwards from Pope Benedict in terms of his sort of pushing the argument. I think half a step backwards. Let's see, artists decided he doesn't really talk about climate change that much.
But people didn't read Benedict, and they're reading Pope Francis.
Yeah, and Benedict didn't write an encyclical on it, yeah. But what's his big encyclical, the really,
Love, something about love.
Caritas in Veritate.
Yes, yeah.
Paragraph 47 to 49 is a mini encyclical in the environment. All right, so, in the introduction, he does not claim to be speaking for himself. He's not an autocrat. He doesn't say, by the way, I'm the Pope, so do what I say. His tone is, look, other people have been saying this, 2 other popes have been talking about this, Bishops' conferences have been talking about this. This is really not anything new. And by the way, I'm not claiming to have the last word. I just want to have a conversation with you. So it's a different tone entirely than from what we're used to. And he is addressing all people of goodwill. Chapter 1, very quickly, as you know, he talks about what the problems are. In chapter 2, he talks about the theology that underpins it, and starts talking about relationship. Chapter 3, he talks about the causes. And then in chapter 4, he talks about what he calls integrated ecology. I'll come back to these very quickly. I want to throw some more stuff at you. Chapter 5 is solutions, and chapter 6 is the best chapter in the whole book. I encourage you, don't give up reading it. You are going to fall in love with chapter 6. It will become a source of prayer and meditation for you. Clues to the text. He cites both Benedict and John Paul 23 times each. I don't think he was so calculated as to make it balance out exactly, but it is interesting that he does. 17 bishops' conferences, including 9 from the so-called developing world. It depends on how you count developing world, but I'll say 9. He cites very, very few theologians, which is a little bit disappointing to me since I've dedicated most of my life to my friend Thomas Aquinas, and he cites him, I think, 2 or 3 times in the entire encyclical. And then Francis Pierre de Chardin, and Al-Kawas is a 14th century Sufi mystic that he likes. That's too disastrous, so look at this one instead. What does this tell you? That's a word count. Those numbers are word counts.
And what's in parentheses is,
The numbers in parentheses are how many times that word appears.
okay,
So he uses creation 248 times.
got it.
Relationships.
Pardon me?
And relationship, it's
Right, relationship. And once you throw in all the cognates, the number of words, the number of times that shows up triples. So I was at this press conference in Ankeny this summer on the day the encyclical was released, and I feel like I've told the story 1,000 times. Barb, have you heard this story 1,000 times?
Maybe.
This journalist got up and asked a question, and the Bishop of Des Moines leaned over and said, I know this guy's a political agenda. You tell him the Pope doesn't really care about politics. And in the meantime, I'm thinking, Bishop, I got to focus on what I'm about to say here. So I went up to the microphone and I said, theologians count words, and the number of times that the Pope uses the word Democrat or Republican is exactly 0. The secular press really wants this to be a political thing, and the Pope is just not playing that game. Themes: the environment, religion and spirituality, crises, and core issues. So, Rector Relatio, 296 times. So I'm reading this encyclical. The story is that I got an early copy in Italian. I happened to read Italian, which was fortunate because, you know how it is, the encyclical comes out and that hour the press wants you to respond to it. So I had a 3-day lead on it, and so I'm working my way through the document. I'm shooting off emails to the other members of our panel at the press conference. And I got halfway through the document and I thought, when's he going to start quoting Thomas? When he's going to talk about reason, right reason? Thomas calls it recta ratio. And then I stopped and realized, oh my gosh, the Pope is inventing a new theology here. The theology not of right reason, recta ratio, but recta relatio, right relationships. And this is what's stunning and really new about this Pope and his approach. Skip that because you know all that, and I'm going to jump now. Oh, we already talked about his style. Okay, so I'm going to skip to I don't know why oh, by the way, this is footnote 141. You got to read your endnotes, young people. Read the footnotes. Footnote 141 turns out to be one of the most important comments in the entire text. Somebody want to read it? If you're done with your lunch, want to read it real loud?
Nor is the light of faith joined to the truth of love, extraneous to the material world, for love is always lived out in body and spirit. The light of faith is an increased incarnate light, radiating from the luminous life of Jesus. It also illumines the material world, trusts its inherent order, and knows that it calls us to an ever-widening path of harmony and understanding. The gaze of science thus benefits from faith. Faith encourages the scientist to remain constantly open to reality in all its inexhaustible richness. Faith awakens the critical sense by preventing research from being satisfied with its own formula and helps it to realize that nature is always greater. By stimulating wonder before the profound mystery of creation, faith broadens the horizon of reason to shed greater light on the world, which discloses itself to scientific investigation.
So, by the way, in one sentence he uses he references light 6 times in one sentence, so it's maybe an important image for him to use. The picture, by the way, is the Eremite, the Hermitage of St. Francis above Assisi. One of the relationships that he's talking about is the relationship between reason and faith, between what science teaches us and what our faith teaches us. And he's really insistent on this, and people of faith really need to take that seriously, don't we? Especially since there are those, in fact, I might very well lose a student after this morning's class because it really disturbed her to consider that the Bible should not be read literally. But a literal reading, we could say a non-scientific reading of the text, is no way to go about being a responsible Christian, of course. And the Pope is really trying to fight hard for this relationship between faith and reason, our reliance on science to give us the information that we need, but on the other hand, he says, the scientific data is in and of itself not sufficient for us to make the judgments that we need to make. So we see it's chapter 3. I don't know why I gave them letters when they're chapter numbers, but that's chapter 3, which you've already done. But let me ask you, just by way of summarizing that last chapter, what does the Pope say about technology in chapter 3? Do you remember?
It creates more problems for us.
Yeah. Is technology a good thing or a bad thing? You might want to cover your ears for the next couple of minutes.
It's both.
All right, which is to say, neither,
Mhm.
right? So if technology is, we can say, morally neutral,
Mhm.
then what makes technology good or bad?
Who does it benefit?
Our use
Who
of
does it benefit?
Our
What?
use of it.
How we use it, and who does it benefit?
Mhm.
Right? Which could be ended up being the same thing.
Sure.
We should be using it for those who need it.
Mhm.
The Pope does have a sort of he does a little riff on young people's addiction to technology and social media, and he's suspicious that it leads to a lack of engagement with real people in the real world, which sounds to me quite a bit like an old man being curmudgeon-y, but it might also be true. Students would completely disagree. What's the difference between quality of life and standard of living?
Standard of living is financial, quality is more affective.
That's nice, I like that. Anybody else?
Yeah, the whole encyclical, the thing that jumped right out at me because it hit me so personally was, do we really need our air conditioners? And things like that, and I looked at that and I thought, holy cow, he's talking to us.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, it really hit me, and I thought, when we do these things and we use these things, we don't think of the consequences to the world and to other people. And so how much do we sacrifice, are we willing to?
Oh, wow. You just set me up really well.
You get the star.
I want to talk about that in particular. The Pope, this idea of suffering and sacrifice turns out to be really crucial. Let's see here. The seamless garment. You know the doctrine of the seamless garment, right? It was Mary Evelyn Eileen Egan is the first person to use this phrase. She was the founder, wasn't she, co-founder of Pax Christi? And then Bishop Bernardin of Chicago picked up on that phrase and sort of made it a popular meme in our Catholic culture. We know what it means though, right? And it's taken from, I think, Matthew's Gospel, where they rolled the dice. They found out that Jesus' garment had no seam and be ashamed to tear it, so let's just gamble for it instead. So the social encyclicals going all the way back to 1891 or whatever it was, to Rerum Novarum, have always argued for this idea of the seamless garment. The Pope is adding our consciousness of threads to the garment that we have neglected. The environment, the natural world, God's creation, is one of the threads in the seamless garment of the social teachings of the Church, too long neglected and now needing to be brought to the forefront and paid attention to. Prior to that, in every social encyclical, right up into Centesimus Annus, refers to nature only a sense of natural resources that should be distributed justly and not sequestered unjustly by the 68 people on the planet who own half the world's wealth. So then he talks about solutions, and one of the solutions that he talks about is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity simply means problems should be solved on the lowest level, that those problems can be solved. And the Pope talks about this. Those are paragraph numbers. But the interesting thing is that the Pope makes clear that the environmental problems can't be solved at the local or regional or even national level. It does require international cooperation. And he does, as I pointed out in an article in December for the Catholic Messenger, he does call for a new international body that has the power to make decisions, which freaks people out. But that, he explicitly calls for it.
Isn't that why it's,
Pardon me?
that's the political part of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not using the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
Not using the United Nations.
Well, it can come out of the United Nations, but there isn't anything that exists. Even Paris was sort of an ad hoc group, and it doesn't have any governing ability. It can't, there's no teeth, they can't enforce anything.
So what is the difference between standard of living and quality of life?
Well, who said it? I think you nailed it really well. They're not unrelated, let's be clear about that.
Yeah.
Social scientists say that if you earn less than $35,000 a year, that does impact your quality of life, not just your standard of living. That's a rather arbitrary number, isn't it? But on the other hand, if you earn more than, I think it's $150,000 a year, it does not enhance your quality of life. So the two are related, we should just say that. It's hard to have a quality of life if you're walking 6 miles a day every day to find clean drinking water. But quality of life has to do with the joy that you derive from being alive.
Because I was going to say it could be relative, quality of life could be irrelative.
That's right, and it has to be, doesn't it? So for example, to go back to our earlier metaphor of the patient who comes in and the doctor says, I can't cure you, but we can come up with mitigation and adaptation strategies. Does that mean that there's no quality of life? Or does that mean that there is a 100% quality of life given the restrictions? You see? So given the restrictions imposed by your condition, you can still enjoy a quality of life. When I teach in my class, I grab a student, usually one who's not paying attention, so I can't actually pick on any of you. But I hold up his little finger, because it's almost always a guy. And I said, if I cut off this little finger, could you still experience a quality of life? This is, well, yeah. So can I cut off your finger? Well, no. Well, let's take that, how far can we take this? If I cut off your hand, could you still enjoy quality of life? Well, yeah. Well, if you keep lopping off, you get to a point where you no longer experience quality of life, right? So, environmentally, how many limbs, how many appendages have we lopped off? How many have atrophied? How many are cancerous? How many, if you follow this metaphor, how far can we continue to degrade the natural world and it still has a quality of existence, a richness. By the way, if I said that quality of life means joy, in ecological terms, that would translate as complexity. A complex ecosystem is a happy ecosystem. The more species and the more members of each species, the healthier the environment, that would be quality of life for a non-human ecosystem. So look at the juxtaposition between these two paragraphs. On the one hand, individual responsibilities. And on the other hand, we have to operate together corporately and internationally in order to land the plane. That's another metaphor that I picked up. The plane is going down. The question is not, can we keep it in the air? We can't. The question is, how rough is the landing going to be? And the longer we wait to address it, the harder the landing is going to be. The more people will suffer. The more expensive it will be. So how do we juxtapose these two? Individuals, philosophically, this is a deontological approach. Philosophically, you identify what is the right thing to do, and you do it. Not for the sake of a reward, and by the way, not because you think you're going to make a difference, but you simply do it because it's the right thing to do. Whether or not you own an air conditioner is not going to make a one diddly squat difference in the ecosystem. But is it the right thing to do to consume fewer resources?
It would be because she'll suffer.
Yeah. You know her, huh?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there are certain things that will make a difference. Unfortunately, we individuals won't ever, we can't do that individually. I upset an awful lot of people, and I really mean it. I mean, I really upset them when I emphasize on the individual scale, your individual moral behavior is not going to make a difference. And I realize that that's a profound sin in our culture, where we are taught that individuals can make a difference. But the fact is we can't. And as a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say wanting to make a difference is a dangerous distraction. Helen Callacott, the founder of Doctors Against Nuclear Madness, an Australian woman, she got burned out a few years ago and said, and I quote, "I used to think I could make a difference, but that was naive," unquote. And then she quit. She just quit and dropped out. She later reinvented herself as Doctors Against Environmental Madness. I don't think that was the name of it, but that was the point of it. So she did bounce back. But we should be making decisions because we know it's the right thing to do. At the same time, we should be making our government, our politicians, our leaders, behave responsibly in our name, because it's the only way anything's going to change. So, in the last chapter then, he talks about spirituality. If you haven't yet read it, I want you to pay attention to the way the Pope's ideas ripple down. They cascade down from very general to very specific elements. That, by the way, is the Church of San Damiano in Assisi, the place to which he went when he was a young man and feeling like he was not happy with the quality of life that he was experiencing. And the crucifix spoke to him and said, "Francis, rebuild my church." So he dedicated the next several months of his life stealing from his father in order to finance rebuilding this little chapel. And then when he got done, he looked around and realized, oh, kind of misunderstood what you meant. On the other hand, we still have this absolutely holy place as an artifact. Have you been there, Tom? Have you been to? Has anybody else? Have you been to? Yeah. I just got back from Italy. I teach a course in Italy every year. And when we get to Assisi, I just warned the kids. I said, you're going to have a spiritual experience. It is inevitable. Here's how I want you to prepare for it. You're going to get up before sunrise and you're going to go up to the Hermitage. And when you get up there, you're going to be absolutely silent. And you're gonna stay there for as long as you want, except you need to be back by 3. When you come back at 3, we're gonna go down and visit San Damiano together. And then we're gonna come out, and then we're gonna talk. And sure enough, people were, well, it works. It's a holy, holy place. It does work. So in any case, the Pope talks about, first he talks about the Trinity. In other words, he's not starting as a Catholic Pope. He's starting as a Christian. So he starts talking about the role of the Trinity. And by the way, this is also theologically not mainstream. Since the Council of Chalcedon, in fact, since the Council of Nicaea, we have argued that the 3 persons of the Trinity act in such close consort with one another that when one acts, the others act as well. The Pope disagrees. The Pope says that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit each contribute something different to God's creation, which is great. Then he talks, so that's his notion of the Trinity. Look for that when you read that section. Then he talks about the incarnation of Christ, and what does that mean? And I want you to reflect on that, especially since we're still in the no, we're not anymore, are we? Sorry, I've been gone. The whole Advent and Christmas season was a season of the incarnation, which is what? It's when God became flesh. It's when reason and faith fused. It's when the natural order and the supernatural order became one, and once united are inseparable. Christ cannot be separated from Jesus. The flesh cannot be separated from the spirit. And an incarnational theology is absolutely, fundamentally, and necessarily an environmental theology. Since we can say, with Chardin, who the Pope quotes, by the way, we can say that the earth is the body of Christ. From that moment, he takes another step into the sacraments, and of course, where does he land sacramentally? Where do you think?
Eucharist.
In the Eucharist. So what is the Eucharist? Now, this is why the Pope gets all Catholic on us, and it's where I'm going to get all Catholic on you too. With all respect to our non-Catholic Christian sisters and brothers, if the Eucharist isn't what we say it is, then the whole thing is just a bunch of nonsense. Because what do we claim that the Eucharist is? The body and the blood of Christ, right? And what does that mean? If we already have an incarnational theology in Christ incarnate in the person of Jesus, then we have to extend that theology to the Eucharist. And that means that that host, which we receive, that little meaningless piece of God's creation, is the body of Christ. If it isn't that, when I was a little kid, we used to take those little candies, those little wafers, those little colored wafers, and they looked just like the old communion hosts, and we would play Mass. If the Eucharist isn't the body and blood of Christ, then we're just little kids playing Mass. And finally, he ends with a reference to the Blessed Mother, which rhetorically is a perfect bookend, because he starts the encyclical way back in the first paragraph by talking about Mother Earth, and he ends by talking about Mary, the Mother of Creation. And that's deliberate. That's stylistically beautiful. And so I want to skip to one last thing to bother you. This is my own notion. Barb, you've heard this 10,000 times by now,
That's
too.
okay, it needs to be repeated.
This is not the Pope's vocabulary, but I believe it is the Pope's theology. I call it redistributed suffering. Now, anytime you want to bail out on any one of these claims, then you're off the hook. But if you accept that scientific crises, environmental crises are real and advanced and anthropogenic, we accept that, then, and since it's true that the primary victims are the poor, the few generations, and the earth itself, by the way, those are the big 3 constituencies. The marginalized, future generations, and the earth itself are the primary victims of ecological crises. And since it's also true that the primary beneficiaries of these behaviors are the world's privilege, then Mark 15:43, we should remove the yoke from those who suffer onto our own shoulders. Suffering is real, suffering is advanced, and suffering is caused by us. The people who are suffering the most are least responsible. The people who are suffering the least are most responsible. It just makes sense that we should bear that cross. Comments?
How do we do
Well,
it? Make changes?
we have, the Pope, the primary problem that the Pope addresses throughout this encyclical is overconsumption. By the way, he mentions overpopulation never by that term, and alludes to it only twice in 2 consecutive paragraphs, in which he says, those of you who want to blame the poor for having too many children are simply trying to divert attention from your responsibility. It's not overpopulation, it's overconsumption. That is my one point of disagreement with the Pope. I do think that overpopulation is a problem. But he is right to say that we are too quick to throw the poor under the bus and hold them responsible, when in fact it is. Statistically, a child in the United States consumes 8 times as much as a child in Bangladesh. So you're going to blame the mother of 8 or the mother of 1? Oh, by the way, even though this is not the Pope's language but mine, you'll notice that I'm able to cite paragraph numbers to demonstrate that I'm not overstating or misstating what he says. So, what do you think of this? Am I being cynical? The way I put it is, it's one thing to sympathize when somebody tells you about her toothache. It's another thing when you have a toothache, you call 911. You get the National Guard involved. You've got to get this problem solved, right? If we accepted our share of the suffering, I think we might be a little more motivated to do something about it. So,
But you say,
One person.
yeah, it's not we as individuals, you say we as corporate, we as government need to feel the weight.
for example, I dare you, although it is easier now, but not easy, I dare you to shop green. It's really, really hard.
And it's more expensive.
And-
Or even to buy clothes that aren't made in sweatshops, how do we know? I mean, so someone said to buy all used clothes, well, I guess you could do that, but.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are things we can do as individuals because we identify it as the right thing to do, including paying more for food because we can afford it.
Exactly.
And if you don't do it, they are not going to produce it.
Mhm.
Years and years and years ago, this is a silly, trivial example, but in my hometown in Council Bluffs, I went out with some high school kids to get some fast food. This is back in the days when I still justified eating it. And so the woman tried to give me this sandwich, and I said, well, would you take it out of the styrofoam package, please? She goes, no, I can't. I said, well, yeah, you can. You can take it out of that package. I won't take it if it's in the package. Well, if you don't take the package, I'm just going to throw it away anyway. So, well, okay, that's fine. You do what you have to do, but I'm not going to take that package. 2 weeks later, or less, there were no more styrofoam packaging in that restaurant. It disappeared.
You made a huge difference.
I don't think so. I think it was a complete accident. I really do. But the point is, when you identify something, act on it. And even if it makes the situation uncomfortable. Does any of you remember taking your grocery bags, your cloth grocery bags to the grocery store before it became sort of socially acceptable? And you must have had clerks say you can't use that, you have to put it in this bag, right? I actually had one, she was the manager, and I made the terrible mistake of using a bag that was stamped with another label. She goes, well, I won't put the groceries in that bag. I said, oh, come on, it's just a bag. no, I won't do it. You can do it yourself, and she stomped off.
Oh,
Anyway, the point is, on an individual basis, we do what needs to be done. We live more simply. By the way, what happens when we live more simply?
We consume less,
Yeah, what else happens?
more joy.
Yeah. Turns out that our joy is not enhanced by what we consume.
What
We
do you-
forget that, don't
what do
we?
you think about the tiny house movement?
The what?
The tiny house movement?
Tiny house? Oh, well, you know, I don't know.
Pretty elaborate though, a lot of them. It's not
I
like
know.
they're.
They strike me as gimmicky,
Okay.
to be really honest.
I just was wondering,
Yeah. Yeah.
they claim to be trying to make less of a footprint.
Well, that's great, and if they are, that's fantastic. And by the way, you're talking to a guy who lives in a 4-bedroom house by himself. So I I could throw stones because it's a big house so big I'll never find a window to break. Yeah. There are trendy things that come and go, but we know where the overall trend is supposed to be, right? And if it's not that, then it's something else that needs to happen. All right, so that, we're back, we cycled back on ourselves. So, unless you guys have any more comments or questions?
So, when you're talking about to do things that are uncomfortable, I mean, it's like, we're needing to make systemic change. We need to keep bugging Congress, our state legislators.
Bernie is right, although not for, I can't remember why he said he was gonna raise taxes. Universal health care. We need to raise taxes on energy. We need to force ourselves out of an oil dependency. That has to happen. And we have to pay for it. We have to pay for amelioration of problems that we've created, and that's going to be expensive. And by the way, the longer we delay, it's just like a health issue. The longer you put it off, the more critical it is, the more expensive it is, and the less successful it will be. We have to start paying the price. I get really annoyed with green advertising, which sells you a light bulb with a demonstration that over time you're going to save money. That might be true, but it feeds the demon. It tells us that we will only do the right thing if it is also financially expedient. And that is true in regards to certain things. You know, you get a more energy efficient furnace over time that will pay back, you know, the additional costs and all those things. Same with hybrid cars and all of those things. But if we're going to sell one another, in fact, if we have to sell the right thing to do based on personal interest, we're really not going to do enough. I could be wrong, but I just don't think doing the right thing is also the cheapest thing. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you brought this up before, we came a little bit late. How does the situation in Flint, Michigan play into this point you're making about costs, benefits?
Yeah, I haven't been looking at that closely at it. It was an antiquated water system, right?
No, they got the dirty, polluted water from the Flint River where
The lead.
auto plants
Right.
and
Plants.
So
chemicals.
okay.
Save money
It
by
corroded the
changing
pipes.
systems.
It's
Okay.
a $1.5 billion estimate to replace, and the victims are poor
Well,
minorities.
I apologize for not knowing this, but it sounds to me like it's a pretty decent illustration of exactly what the Pope is talking about.
That's right, let's try to figure out how it fits in.
Yeah, I'm
because
not sure, because again, I didn't know that it was even caused by environmental pollution.
It was caused by cost-saving measure by the Republican governor. Not that the
But
public cared.
it was, but where's the lead coming from?
The pipes.
The pipes themselves.
That's what I
The
thought.
water is so toxic that it corroded the lining of the pipes, the lead got in
exposed
the
the lead.
water. And little children now have lead in
Yeah,
them.
yeah. A lot of things that we don't normally perceive of as being environmental problems, if you follow the evidence back, turns out to be an environmental crisis. The problem with the mosquitoes in Brazil, right? Yeah, that's an environmental problem. Ebola is an environmental problem.
So now their next problem's gonna be what to do with all the plastic water bottles, because everybody in Flint now, they're bringing in tons and tons and tons of water bottles to.
Well, I heard they have recycling set up for that, I just heard
Yeah.
that.
Holy cow, and now I see the federal government's
If
gonna
they
put
can
a
get that,
fortune
they'll-
into following the children forever to try to do
Right.
what they can to help with their health, now that they.
There's a BBC had an article a couple of days ago that said there's now enough plastic in the world to envelop the planet 7 times. We can
believe it.
wrap the planet in plastic 7 layers deep.
Oh my gosh.
And you buy the organic spinach, but it's in a plastic container.
I know. It is crazy, yeah. Yeah.
Have you got an action plan? What can a church, for example, do?
Well, you know, I can't even get, God bless St. Andrew's Bluegrass. I love those folks. But I've been there 7 years and I can't get them to stop using styrofoam cups for their
Coffee
after
hour.
mass coffee.
That's where I
They
thought,
gave me, I have a mug. They gave me a ceramic mug, but everybody else still uses.
Install a dishwasher.
Yeah.
Holy Family washes all the dishes after coffee.
An action plan would be, on the individual level, to be more conscious of our consumptive habits. And that's what the Pope identifies as the primary problem. What we consume and how much of it we consume, and to reduce it. Lower yourself in terms of diet, but reduce the amount of meat that you consume. I have my own self, I have 4 rules for when I can eat meat. I can eat it if I raised it. I can eat it if it's native. I can eat it if it's a cultural experience, and I can eat it when I'm pouting about something. Those are my 4 rules.
And you don't pout very often.
Huh?
And you don't pout very
Yeah,
often.
there is a 5th rule. I eat meat today because I eat what's offered to me when I'm eating in somebody else's place. Yeah, that's the individual thing we can do. And by the way, I really do believe and experience that these sorts of behaviors, not all of them, I really, really hate my eco shower head. I really, really, really hate it.
in the low flush toilets.
Yeah, yeah. But in the large part, you find sort of a liberation from things that we used to think of as necessity. My dryer broke, and I thought, well, that's a sign from God. I don't believe in such nonsense, by the way, but I decided, well, I'm not going to dry my clothes anymore. They're just going to hang dry. So I do miss that fluffy. So there's that. But the most important thing we can do is we have to elect people who will, who believe that there's a problem and who have the courage to do something about it. That's really the most important thing we can do, because the solutions have to be done corporately, not individually.
But that's what's frustrating, there is nobody who has the courage to do anything because they want to be reelected.
Well, Obama, because he can't be reelected, went out signing the most important piece of international legislation in the history of the planet. So maybe that's, maybe presidential term limits is the answer. But that's the other thing, why can't they get reelected? Because we won't vote for them.
Father, do you share your slides at all?
I was gonna
Your,
ask that too.
Stats were pretty interesting at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I can do that, but you should keep in mind that some of those slides are already dated.
Yeah.
The stuff changes rather quickly.
Right.
But I
You were pretty
should
good
do
about
that.
dating them.
Can I just copy it onto the server or something?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
You can email your PowerPoint to one of those, Father, and we also are taping this. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, but the slides would be great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
email it to John.
We'll just put it on the old drive too.
I can put it on the O drive right now.
Oh,
Or I
it'll be
mean,
too big, it'll be too big.
No, I'll have to wait after.
The slides won't be.
I'm logged in.
It's a big thing. You have to, it has to be
Yes.
uploaded to Google Docs and then unloaded from there. Because obviously it's a big thing.
Well, Father, you've given us great information and wonderful resources. I think, you know, at least for me, you've informed me how I can do my job better as it relates to serving the Chancery and the Diocese of Davenport. And I hope this won't be the last time you come and visit.
Oh, no.
Yes, thank you so
Did you
much.
see word reading?
Thank you.
See word reading?
Oh, right, yeah, good for you.
And no recycling, oops, there's a little styrofoam, but we're not getting anywhere.